Welcome to the TH Fantasy Football Show, hosted by Pestell and Ed.
The Detroit Lions are spoilt for riches when it comes to fantasy football production. A fantastic 1-2 punch at running back and a world-class receiver as well. But we're in for a different type of season this season with several changes in Detroit. Before we get into the players, Murph, do you want to kind of draw a reference to some of the stylistic changes that we might be expecting to see?
Yeah, I think the first thing to talk about here is around the fact there is a new offensive coordinator in town. So Ben Johnson has left, and he's gone to he's going to be the head coach of the Chicago Bears. So that will be exciting. And they have brought in John Morton. Now, John Morton is a very experienced coach, a very experienced sort of play caller. He's previously been at Denver. He's worked with John Gruden. He's been around the league a long time. He actually was with the Lions back in 2022 in a slightly different role. So we've got this massive stylistic change. You've got a bit more of a traditional coach, someone who really is looking for chunk yardage, makes ball security a huge priority, is going to be very, very important to look at third downs here because he does push that third down efficiency. Whilst also looking to be quite adaptable. And I think what we've seen with Ben Johnson is this offense that's very efficient. It works very quickly. It bangs out a lot of plays. It's high scoring, high tempo all the time. And I think what you're going to see with the Lions this year under Morton is you're going to see less plays, so there's going to be less snaps. So therefore, that means there's less opportunities. I think the points will go down a little bit as well as a result of that. But I think you'll also see a bit more of a spread. So I think you're going to want to see Morton. He's going to get the ball downfield more. He's going to look to try and cheat a little bit, and he's going to look to really go for those deep passes. So I think you're going to see Jameson Williams probably pop up a little bit more running deep. And then I think you're going to see a lot more of these sort of zone runs incorporated, which should really enable Gibbs more. And I think we might see a little bit of regression for Montgomery, but we'll get into all those there. But they've got a very athletic offensive line, so you're going to have a few different pieces. But if you look at their offense stylistically, it was a very, very simple to coordinate offense. Jared Goff wasn't being asked to do a lot in terms of throwing the ball downfield. In fact, he only threw. I'm just working it out now. About 90 passes downfield last season, where we call deep. And everything else was kind of really, really short in terms of their yardage breakdown. So it will be a little bit different this year, and they will have to be required to do a little bit different as a result of that. So we are going to see a bit of a changing of the guard.
Well, let's start having a look at how that will impact the different fancy pieces you may use to build your roster for redraft this offseason. And we'll start off with Jared Goff, who we've already mentioned. I've kind of put my open point that he's consistently fine for fantasy. And he's always available, which obviously is always a massive asset. 20-plus point games last year, he had 7. The worry is he then had 6 games that were lower than 12 points. But when you're drafting a quarterback at that stage, that's kind of what you take from that, isn't it? That's what you expect when you draft him a bit later on. Yeah. Interesting stat for him last year, and say that certain play style came into it. He's only one of 6 QBs ever to throw for 4,600 yards plus 35 touchdowns and win 14 games. Now, there's some specific numbers in there, obviously, to help you get to that 6 people only. But in a year where Josh Allen didn't have a Josh Allen season, Lamar Jackson didn't have the season he had, Saquon Barkley didn't have the season he had, he would have perhaps been in the mix and conversation for MVP, but got nowhere near it with such absolute worldly seasons being had there. I suppose my thought is he going to be negatively impacted for fantasy with that change in Detroit? And is he being drafted at his ceiling? Because at the minute, he's going ADP QB9. That is a little bit too rich for me, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think he's QB9 this year. I think there's some context before we talk about this. If I talk about QB9 in my rankings, I have that at, say, 315 points-ish. Okay. This is in 6-point touchdown. So 4-point, it would be even closer. I have Jared Goff sort of 7 spots behind that, but only scoring less than 16 fewer points. So you're drafting him in his ceiling. I think that's a fair point. I kind of think that there's just this point of when you get to QB 8-ish, that sort of range, it's a bit meh. Like it's a bit take a guy. You can take a Dak Prescott, a Bo Nix, a Drake May, a Justin Herbert, a JJ McCarthy, a Trevor Lawrence, a Jared Goff, a Brock Purdy. I think you could take I'd even throw Caleb Williams this year because I think he's going to get a bounce. I think you could take any of those guys and they're all going to do about the same, plus or minus 1.5 per game on average. So you just got this big pool, and this has been true at the quarterback position for 20 years, that, yeah, you're fine to take Goff. It's a very safe floor. There's not a lot of ceiling there. So it's fine. But I think I would rather shoot for the guys I think who can get over the top. So we see Dak Prescott get there. Drake May with his rushing ability can get there. You got Bo Nix with a bit of rushing ability can potentially move up. We've seen Justin Herbert have a good season. JJ McCarthy could be phenomenal. We don't know. Like for me, I think if you're just going to play it safe, I can take a Brock Purdy and a Jared Goff. That's fine, and that's how you want to play. But I'm not excited to draft Jared Goff. Like you say, it's fine. Like it's safe. But do you win anything by being safe? I don't know. Not for me, but yeah, I think there's some regression in here. But I also don't think it's, as you say, streamable QB option. It's fine. I just don't think you're going to get a huge value from, especially on his current ADP. I think I'd rather take a shot and I have, let's say, for example, Bryce Young. Now, I have Bryce Young well lower. But at least if you want to try and put a piece together with a young rookie, with an offensive coordinator who potentially could coach and do something different, I'd almost fancy that. Not that I would do it, but at least I could see that argument. I just think if you drafted Jared Goff, you're just basically saying, yeah, I don't care about the position. It's fine. and there's nothing against that if you want to load up in the other positions. But I don't think anyone is going to pound the table and rush the board to take Jared Goff and feel really good about it, unless you're a Lions fan.
Before we move on to a player that I am very excited to draft and to talk about, please do take a moment to subscribe, give us a like and a share as well. And once you finish with this show with Murph and I, head out and have a look at one of the 31 other deep dive shows as we profile every single NFL team throughout the offseason, ready for your redraft drafts. Let's turn up the excitement a little bit though, Murph, and that is with Mr. Jahmyr Gibbs. What a season last year. Just what a phenomenal season. So rushing 250 carries, 1,412 yards, 16 touchdowns, and then throw some receiving as well if that isn't enough. 63 targets, just over 500 yards and 4 touchdowns as well. All whilst he has David Montgomery sat just behind him as well. For me, this is pretty straightforward with Jahmyr Gibbs. Is there any reason he slows down? I don't really see so, even with those changes. I think he's just too important. He's in my mix for RB1 overall this year, especially with that receiving work as well. I've got him ranked as RB3. It's going as RB3. If I'm on the clock in the middle of round 1 and Jahmyr Gibbs is there, I'm quite tempted to punch him in there. Am I being too optimistic, or is it as straightforward as that with Gibbs?
I think there's some cause for concern, not loads.
Oh, don't tell me that.
But I think I mean, I have him at RB5, but I will say this: I have 2 players ahead of him that I have aggressively ranked, which is Jonathan Taylor and Christian McCaffrey. Now, they're 2 players I have aggressively ranked for very, very different reasons, and we're not on those shows, so I'm not going to talk about them. I'm going to talk a little bit about Jahmyr Gibbs and why I'm just... Now, listen, I'm RB5, so we're kind of splitting hairs here. But I will pour a little bit of cold water here on Jahmyr Gibbs, and we've got to look at... There's some natural touchdown regression that's going to come his way. So he scored 16 total touchdowns in 2024. Now I wrote in the Fantasy Football Playbook, which is a book I write every year, although I took the last 2 years off for health reasons. But I talked about him in particular as someone that is he outperformed his touchdown number by close to 5 touchdowns. Now, I think in elite talent, you'd say there's always going to be a bit of overperformance, and I think that's fine. But there is something that is quite alarming in here, which is that he scored on 43% of his green zone touches in 2024. Now, if you don't know what green zone, because you know what the red zone is, green zone is basically from the 10-yard line. So that's what statistically we call the green zone. 43% of his carries inside the 10 he scored from. Now, pretty good performance is around about 27-28%. The league average is about 20%. So he is grossly overperformed in efficiency. And you also have David Montgomery there. Now, part of this touchdown number that came his way was because David Montgomery missed 4 games towards the end of the season as well. So that touchdown total dipped for Montgomery because he was injured. I expect that Jahmyr Gibbs' number will go down 2 ways. 1, because Montgomery will eat into it. And 2, if healthy. And 2, that he won't be as efficient. So I'm not saying that Jahmyr Gibbs is a bust and far from it. But I project him in the sort of 9 to 11 touchdown range. I actually have him with receiving at sort of 12, 13 because I'm giving him that elite performance. But I don't have him anywhere near the touchdown totals that he put up last season because he was just so hyper efficient. And it's very rare to keep that level of efficiency up. But that's not to say you should be scared. It's just a case of if you're buying him at his ceiling, and for me, his ceiling is RB3, and there is a way that he gets there, of course. You're going to have to do it if you want him because he's a first-round player, and I don't think there's any argument in that, and that's fine to do it. Just, I can't see a pathway in his current standing to be the RB1 at the end of the season. And I just think there's other players that have that likely range of outcomes over him. So I can see a world that he could get to RB3. I can't see a way he gets to RB1, but I can see a way that he finishes at RB9. So that's my only sort of concern there with him.
You've already mentioned there who he has as backup. So the Sonic and Knuckles, I think as they went by last year, a player that at cost had a fantastic season last year. So the RB18 overall, being drafted to the RB21. But that was RB18, as you said, missing at those last 4 games of the season as well. He just relentlessly kept finding the end zone. Week in, week out, he seemed to find his way there. Even missing those last few games, even though he only averaged 42% of snaps. From the RB2, I think 14 points and above. I'm pretty happy with as a consistent sort of score. He got 10 games of 14 above, including 3 at 20 plus. 12 touchdowns over the course of the season made him so reliable. It feels like he's been around forever. He's only 28 as well. So we're not quite at that cliff yet. He said he ended the season with an injury, but it just worked perfectly. That tandem of Gibbs and Monty we've spoken about with so many other pairings that we've seen being formed over the offseason, and that is almost like the benchmark, isn't it? I've got him ranked as RB21. He's going off the board as RB21, going around round 5. I think he could do far worse with other players going around there. I think all those same things we said before, all those same concerns about the Lions are all there. But Monty just seems to, year in, year out, get it done.
Yeah, I agree. I actually have him higher ranked than that. I have him at 16. So again, for all the reasons that I'm a little bit down on Gibbs against consensus, now it's 3 to 5. It's not a huge drop. I'm for Montgomery. I just think he gets he missed 4 games, and where he finished last season was absolutely incredible. Add what he would have done in those 4 games, and you're talking about a fringe running back 1 overall. I don't think it's going to be quite that rosy, but I think you're looking at a player that I have projecting at 1,100 yards from scrimmage. He's Probably underrated as a receiver as well. And I think that's something that doesn't really get spoken about. I've got him getting 40 targets this year. And I think that they will look to rely, especially as they're trying to activate that RPO, as they're trying to get the ball downfield, they're going to be presented opportunities where they can dump off to David Montgomery even more. So I really like David Montgomery. I think it's one of those, it's not a sexy pick, but it's one of those that I think will do you very nicely at ADP. And if you think about the players that you can get around that range. Now, I do think that there's a couple of players in that range that I probably would have over him. Alvin Kamara, for example, is wearing off at a very similar ADP, who's a player I would probably run to the board to over David Montgomery. But I'm all for this pick. I think it's a very successful pick, and it's a very successful strategy that will yield you good returns coming into 2025.
And in interest, what you're saying that I was just having a quick look that if he'd played those last few games and has averaged a 10-point a game, as we saw him do relentlessly, he would have ended up as the RB12 overall last year. So that's obviously based on PPR scoring, so that reception count comes in there as well. But yeah, it was such a good season. You're right. He seems to be undervalued all the time, and he just keeps getting it done. You can see why over the last couple of years alongside Gibbs, but he's performed. A player that also seems to be going from strength to strength. He still has that list of people who went before him to keep himself focused. That is Amon Ra St. So finished off as the wide receiver 3 last year after being drafted as the wide receiver 5, according to ADP. 7 top 12 finishes, all of those 20-plus times as well. And that included a 37-point and a 38-point finish as well. 100 receptions, 1,100 yards over the last 3 seasons consistently, and followed up his 10 touchdowns in 2023 with 12 in 2024. We talk about that touchdown regression. We think potentially we've seen what can be a reliable sort of area. Yes, we said about the regression for Goff as well this year, but Amon Ra St. has shown his worth there. Injury watch. So he's had some work done in the offseason on a knee injury. I don't think anything unduly to be concerned about, but it is worth just keeping it half an eye on as we go through the season as well. I'm happy to take him round 1 and bank the fancy points, but after what you mentioned earlier, I do wonder if you have any Jameson Williams-shaped question marks alongside that as well, as he potentially works in. Where are you seeing Amon Ra this year?
No, I'm not concerned about Amon Ra. I have him at wide receiver 3. So I think, I sort of put some cause to concern there for Amon Ra St. I don't. And I think there's 2 very good reasons. When you change an offense and you change an offensive coordinator and you change the play calls, the playbook, you're looking at the different types. When a quarterback is in trouble, he's going to go to what he knows, and he's going to go to a receiver who is going to always deliver him a result. And I had this argument with Jim Coventry on my show a few weeks ago where he was concerned about Amon Ra, and I was like, it's always the case that you always go to the devil you know. You go to what you know to get you out of trouble. And there's going to be this line of communication that's a good few years old now between Goff and Amon Ra St. that they are intrinsically linked. They do understand each other's games, and Goff will always be able to find him. So I'm not overly concerned about Amon Ra St. and the performance that you're going to get out of him. I think it's pretty automatic that he will end up in the top 3. If he doesn't, I think what's the worst outcome? Wide receiver 6 maybe is like as bad as it gets. I don't see a world in which that is going to happen. I don't see a world that it's going to be that bad. I think he will see less targets, but I think he will make more catches, if that kind of makes sense, to balance out the reduction of targets, because I think he's going to get maybe some higher quality targets. And I think he's going to get a little bit more those sort of steady completions for third downs. When you go to third down, you go to your guy, you go to the person that you can really bank on and really know is going to deliver you that third down, which is why I think they're going to pepper him a lot more than other players. And so that's why, for me, I feel pretty good taking him in in role, like in terms of where he is in the first round and at his ADP. I think he's a value if we can even stretch that far to calling a player in round one a value, but I think it's fine. Like I feel pretty good about him and taking him there, and that suits all parties for me. So I think it's a great advantage to have a player like that available and a player that people are talking about because they're worried about what's going to happen with Ben Johnson. I don't think it's going to affect the players we've had now. I think it's going to affect other players that we're going to talk about.
And one of those players I'm really not quite sure what to make of at this time of the season. So I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say about Jameson Williams. Firstly, I think he quietly had a pretty good season last year. So wide receiver 22, Ed and I spoke on previous shows that the number of wide receivers that missed time last year does impact some of these a little bit. So it doesn't quite feel like a normal wide receiver 22 season. I think the thing for Jameson Williams, he had a couple of absolute stinkers mixed in throughout the season as well, where he just, say, fancy-wise, he did nothing despite being on the field. But when looking at games, nearly a quarter of his games, he finished up as a wide receiver 1. Just over a third, he was top 24. It's the third of the games outside wide receiver 3 might have burnt you, but you drafted him last year around wide receiver 48, so you absolutely cannot quibble about that. I say I'm really not sure, Murph, so I'm interested in what your thoughts are on Jameson Williams' outlook this season.
So going back last year, I was a player I pounded the table for. You were getting him in round 9, round 10. And I was like, he's an absolute auto pick. And I was like, oh, I don't think he can be that good. I was like, in round 9, round 10, like he's worth the upside of shooting for the moon. Like, who are you getting in that range? Who's got the range of outcomes that Jameson Williams has? This year, I think he's almost priced at ceiling. Now, I think it's going to be what we saw last year from Jameson Williams with these absolute boom weeks, as you sort of mentioned. We're talking about, week 1, he went off over 19 fantasy points. We saw these sort of huge spike weeks from him. Week 4, 14 points, 14.7 points. We got some big games out of him, but it was down the stretch. He was really big. 21 points week 16, 19.5 points championship week. And I always find there's that correlation of when you get a player who does very, very well in the fantasy playoffs and helps you win a title, his ADP seems to get a boost the following year. Now, actually, I don't hate his ADP. I have him around this range of wide receiver 25, and I think it's fine. I think there's a good range of outcomes here. But I don't see a pathway to him probably exceeding this kind of ADP range because I think he is going to have some really big weeks. I think he's going to have, I liken him to almost like a more polished Rashid Shaheed. And I think you're going to get some really big weeks where John Morton's going to throw the ball downfield and he's going to have like a couple of those really big, enormous 140, 150-yard weeks and potentially win you a week. But as you say, he's going to absolutely litter you with some stinkers. So when you're taking a wide receiver at 25 in that sort of range, you're thinking like at this range, we're round 5, round 6 kind of level. You want a little bit of consistency. Now, I'm not saying that you don't want that upside. In a best ball world, he's phenomenal. He's exactly what you want. But in a redraft league, you're going to have to be prepared to sit him as frequently as you start him. And I just think if I'm taking a player in that range, is that someone I really want to really rush out and get at his current value? Or am I going to take other players who I know are going to return me similar numbers across the season, but actually it's a bit more predictable in terms of what I'm going to get? And I guess it's the way that you play fantasy football. If you're quite happy with this boom and bust range of outcomes and you're happy to pay that sort of round 5, round 6 price, he's your guy. He's going to have wide receiver 1 weeks where he's going to finish in the top 6, 7 of the position. But he's going to have weeks where he absolutely kills you and he'll lose you as many as he wins. And if you listen to Bob Long, and I had him on my show last week, but if you read his consistency guide and you're thinking he's the kind of player that will cost you a playoff spot because of that inconsistent performance if you're not too careful. So it's just bearing that in mind a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, looking at last year, so roughly a third of his games he was top 24, a third of games he was 24 to 36, a third of games he was outside that top 36.
Yeah,
And
but like
there's
70,
certainly
80s, there's lots of really low scores.
Yeah, exactly. And so the low ones were properly low, isn't it? In there.
Yeah.
I think when we're looking then at, before we move on to kind of talk about the rest of the depth chart, this is the point of view where I'm not going to say changes at Detroit. I think there's much being spoken about, but we are recording on the 15th of July. So if anything has changed from his depth chart by the time you're viewing this, that is why, because we could predict the future. We would pick all the right players at all the right costs. Tim Patrick, last year, 2 games as a top 36 wide receiver. Didn't set the world light, but didn't really need to. I'm out of these players. Khalif Raymond doesn't greatly interest me. If I'm completely honest, not sure when we talk about him too much. Now, none of these interest me from the point of view of drafting in redraft. They're all kind of waiver wire watches for me. But it is Isaac Tesla that I do find a little bit interesting. I think if Amon Ra or Williams goes down, it's Tesla that I think I'm going to be keeping an eye on. Detroit draft well, we know that, and they traded up to get him when they drafted him out of Arkansas. So he is one that is my only real indicator why that's where I think I'd go. Out of those 3, can any of them have fancy value in their own rights with everyone healthy? Or if someone does go down, which of that trio do you think is most likely to benefit?
So in their own rights, if everyone's healthy, there's no reason to touch any of these players. You're talking about a wide receiver room that is not getting a lot of targets last season. If you exclude Amon Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, and the 2 running backs we've talked about, and Craig Reynolds. Now, Craig Reynolds is always going to get a serious amount of dump offs. He's going to get almost as many targets as the rest of these wide receivers that we're talking about. He had more targets than Khalif Raymond as a percentage of targets anyway. You know, Tim Patrick got 8% of targets last year. Khalif Raymond got 4%. There just isn't really, there's a small sort of use case for a Tim Patrick in the sense of he will do what he does and he'll have a couple of games where he'll hit the box score, but it's nothing that you want to draft or try and pick up. And I think the same will be with Tesla. I think it's going to be very, very similar. He's very much a project player. He's a player, I think, when you're thinking about this offense going forward and they go through this evolution, I don't see them putting out they'll put a lot of 3 wide receiver sets out, but I don't see them utilizing, with the way they utilize the running backs, a huge percentage of their plays going to wide receivers 3 and below. So I think on a week-to-week basis, not important. Tesla is the guy you probably want to keep an eye on if there is something going on with Amon Ra St. Brown with this knee. I think Tim Patrick is the Jameson Williams sort of cover in that role, because when we saw this last season when Jameson Williams missed 2 games, Tim Patrick saw 77% of snaps in both of those games. Actually, Tim Patrick towards the end of the season got a nice sort of bump usage as well, 81% in week 16, it being notable in week 15, being notable there as well. So I think, Tim Patrick's going to have a role. It's not draftable. It's not one you really want to pick up for fantasy football unless Jameson Williams goes down. Tesla is a guy to keep an eye on, and people might leap to think it's Patrick that will get the same Brown role, but it won't be. It will be Tesla.
And then to wrap things up, when we finish thinking about the competition for targets, obviously Sam Laporta is there as well. A player that, through being far too highly drafted, ended up being a monumental bust for fantasy last year. On our shows last year, Ed and I couldn't quite fathom why he was being drafted quite as high as he was in round 2 last year, because it just didn't seem to be sustainable what we'd seen already. However, we did not predict the drop down to finish up tight end 8 overall. It was drafted too high, I've said. So only 3 10-plus point games in weeks 1 to 12. That's where people were really in full panic mode and think, right, I think there was talk of Laporte and Andrews both being droppable at times in the first early part of the season. Then he closed the season with 6 10-point games in a row, as he had absolutely solid form. Most of those finishing as their top 12 tight end consistently as well. Tight end 4, round 5, where he's going at the moment, feels about right. We've said about that tight as the pack for quarterback. I think for me, once I get from Bowers, McBride, and Kittle, there is that kind of mixed sort of area then. But Laporte is probably my absolute last thoughts at taking an earlier tight end before I'm leaving it till the end of the draft, and I might take a gamble on a couple of other names that I'm interested in. How are you feeling about Sam Laporte? Is this the bounce back season, or was last year what we can come to expect?
I think we're going to see more of last season this season. If I'm looking at this change in offense, I think when you're a first year coordinator, you're going to go with what worked for you last season, but you're going to work with, and again, when we look at the kind of style of offense and you look at where you've got the deep ball threat, so I think Williams is going to get a bump in targets. Whether that yields to catches and things is a different question. They're not going to run as many plays. And so I've already talked about a number of players who are going to see a bump in targets, or they're going to see their usage increase. That has to come from somewhere, and it's going to come from Sam Laporte. Unfortunately, that you've got a player here who is immensely talented, and he will not finish in the fantasy worlds along where he should. But unfortunately, I have him at tight end 6, and I kind of can make an argument that I probably have an Evan Ingram underranked, and then I'm kind of conservative on TJ Hawkinson because of this injury and the JJ McCarthy world, and what does that kind of look like? So again, I'm kind of thinking like he's 6. I can really make a case for 8. And then I still have below that like Mark Andrews, who could go bananas if healthy. Jake Ferguson with Dak Prescott back. Who knows what Darren Waller does? What is Tyler Warren going to do in an Indianapolis Colts offense that's going to have a more passing attack to it with Daniel Jones? This is the part where I'm like, I'm struggling to pay the price on Sam Laporta. Give me Kelsey's going after him in drafts. I'd rather have Kelsey. Give me Njoku. We've seen what that partnership looks like with Flacco. Give me Hawkinson. Bounce back. Could be bad, could be good, but the price, I'm getting value on that. Evan Ingram's going later. Tyler Warren is cheap. Mark Andrews is cheap. All these guys I've mentioned, they're all cheap. So much cheaper. And they might finish level with Laporta, might finish above him. I don't see a world that Laporta is breaking 220 points in PPR. And you can't pay that price of 5th round for Sam Laporta and chase the history. I think you're better off walking away and just going, yeah, I'll take someone else. I'll let someone else take Sam Laporta, because I think, especially this year, I don't think it's going to happen for him. Future years, maybe, like dynasty assets, don't get too worried, but this year I'm a little concerned.
And for all of those reasons you've just said, I surprised myself when I clicked across, because I've got on my notes written down. I've written tight end 6 to 8. So I must have been feeling very Laporta happy when I typed this up and put him down as tight end 4, because I agree with everything you said there. And Hawkinson is a player that, once again, I've battled with thinking, actually, is he going far too low at the minute? So, yeah, agree with all of those points. The one thing that is for certain, though, is the Detroit Lions are going to be incredibly fantasy relevant throughout the course of the season. And amazing when we think where we've come from about 3 or 4 years ago, where there was very little you wanted from the Lions offense. And now they are a wealth of riches, or potential riches anyway. Well, thank you very much for joining us to talk all things Detroit Lions, Murph. Always a pleasure to have you on. Where can people find you and the rest of your content if they want to absorb some more of your knowledge, as we have done over the last half hour?
Well, thanks, mate. Thanks for having me on, as always. You can catch me on 5 Yard Rush. We're approaching 1,000 podcasts. You can catch us 5 Yard Rush on X. You can catch us 5 Yard Rush on TikTok, 5 Yard Rush on YouTube. Lots of YouTube stuff going on at the moment. Lots of great guests, lots of great content. We published our fantasy football playbook. That's out on Amazon. You can get a copy of that, and that will give you the access to a load of tools, including a projection sheet that's going to allow you to customize for your own leagues and all these charity leagues. I'm doing loads of charity league deep dives. I'm doing one for your league as well coming up in the next few days, hopefully, at time of recording. So, a lot of fun. Get involved, get engaged. We're going to be launching our listener league soon, so you'll want to drop in on those. There's some very, very interesting formats on those as well.
Amazing. And we will make sure we pop a link to that book on Amazon as well. So head down to the comments now and get yourself a copy if you have not already done so. Well, thank you very much, Murph. Said a pleasure as always. But for now, it is goodbye from me, goodbye from Murph, and time for Malcolm to take us home.
You have been listening to Pestell and Ed of TH Fantasy Football. For more content, follow TH_fantasy_NFL on Instagram and Twitter.